Today we want to talk about the topic of joints. And a joint is the connection between two or more bones or between cartilage and a bone. So the purpose of this is the joints are essential in what we call articulation. And what is articulation? Well, articulation refers to the smooth movement of one bone upon another. So as for instance, if you raise your lower leg and straighten it out, how the lower leg moves smoothly over the upper part of your leg at the knee. The next thing we need to talk about is how are joints classified, and one of the ways that they're classified is by the kind of joint. And what we mean by that is how are they designed for a specific function and what degree of movement that they have. A freely movable joint, and that's going to be most of the joints in the skeleton are free to move around. That doesn't mean they can move in every possible direction. The ends of the bones are shaped in such a way that they can move like that. So they'll often be rounded or fit into something else that's rounded so they can have this high degree of movement. Then we have some joints that we call slightly movable joints. And in a slightly movable joint, they're usually a pad of cartilage between the bone ends that permit a little bit of movement. An example is shown there where we have like your hip fits inside of the hip joint in the pelvis, and there is a limited movement there. It's sufficient for us to be able to move freely, but you can't move your leg in every possible direction. Then we have what we call immovable joints, and these are the sutures that are interlocking the bones that make up your skull. You can remember those little ziggy lines there are the sutures, and those bones are immovable. They no longer can move over each other. There's no cartilage in between to allow any movement. So let's look at the movable joints in a little bit more detail. Of the movable joints, we have one kind that are called the ball and socket. And the ball and socket, we have two of those. This is where our legs articulate with the hips, or our arms articulate with the shoulder. So those are ball and socket. It allows you to rotate your arm in any direction. You can even twist your arm. Same thing with your leg. It allows a large degree of movement. Then we have what are called the hinge joints, and the hinge joints allow it to bend in only one direction. Your elbow, your knee, your fingers and toes are only supposed to bend in one direction. Then we have what are called the pivot joints. They allow rotating and swiveling, and this would be the bones that make up at the top of your cervical vertebrae that are in your neck, and where the skull fits on top of it, it allows your skull to pivot on the end of it, so you can look from side to side and look up and look down and things like that. Then we have the gliding joints. They have limited movement sideways and up and down. And these would be like the joints that make up your wrist. We call them the carpal bones that make up your wrist, or the tarsal bones that make up your ankle. It allows you to a certain amount of movement up and down and sideways. So we call those gliding joints. The bones that provide for attachment for muscles uh, have tendons, and these tendons are connected quite often in one part to a bone, and then the other part connects to a muscle. So that's like the way the muscles are attached to the bone allows the muscle's action to move that bone. And an example of tendons would be like your Achilles tendon that is used to raise your heel closer to your knee. And so in other words, your toe is going to point down. Then we have ligaments, and the ligaments hold bones of a joint together. They keep the bones from becoming out of alignment with each other, but still allow a certain degree of movement. And the tighter the ligaments, the less movement you have, and they can become stretched to a degree to allow a greater degree of movement, but still prevents it from moving in directions that it shouldn't move. So let's look at a joint up close, and the location of the ligaments and the muscle attachment and the presence of other bones might restrict movement, and that's governed by the amount of movement in the joint, or that actually governs the amount of movement in the joint. Connective tissue called a joint capsule, and in this diagram, the joint capsule is going to create this joint cavity that you can see right here. Inside of the or the inner surface of that joint cavity is going to be called the synovial membrane that lines the inside of it, and it produces synovial fluid, which is a very slippery fluid that lubricates the joint. It also acts like a shock absorber to take some of the jolting out of walking or jumping and things like that, for instance, in your knees. So inside this sac, the joint capsule, we have a cavity that's filled with synovial fluid that lubricates the joint. So the bone is not bone on bone, which would be very painful if it were. And then also in the same area, we have bursa. And we'll talk a little bit about bursa, but you can see that the bursa are in among the ligaments and tendons. They provide like gliding surfaces over as the tendons move back and forth, so they aren't rubbing on each other. So you can probably see this a little bit better in this cross section of a knee where the bursa are located. You have the muscle attached by a tendon to your kneecap, and notice that that muscle and tendon is separated from your upper leg bone, your femur, by the bursa. So the bursa are these blue shaped objects right here, and so they're between tendons and ligaments and bones, so they don't rub on each other. So they cushion, they reduce friction. But if they become inflamed for some reason or another, uh, they uh, will produce, or they will cause a very painful feeling that you'll have when you want to move that joint. So uh, bursitis has to do with bursa, and itis means, that last part usually means an inflammation of the bursa, and it will be painful when you try to move that joint. Now, what are some joint disorders that there are? One that some of you have experienced is called a sprain, and a sprain is an injury of the ligaments and tendons uh, around a joint. And as you can see in this picture right here, it's often accompanied by blood vessels that have been ruptured, and you see this reddish purple area, which will eventually turn kind of greenish colored as it begins to heal. So that would be one injury of a joint, but it's an injury to the ligaments and the tendons. Arthritis is an inflammation of the joint. Uh, it's often something that elderly people experience, and the joint becomes thicker, as you can see in the fingers on the hand that's at the left. You can see that like the middle two fingers have the upper joints are a lot thicker. It becomes inflamed and makes it much harder for the joint to bend. And as you can see at which would be like the left hand, look at the which would be like the ring finger. Notice that the tip of the finger is kind of cocked off to one side. It can cause the joints to become misshapen and difficult to bend, or maybe even almost impossible to bend. There are other joint disorders, but these are the only two that we're going to cover in here. Now, the last thing we want to cover today about the skeleton is the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the part that's in kind of a greenish blue or a bluish green, however you want to say that, and that makes up the axial skeleton. So the bones that I would like you to know the names of that are part of the axial skeleton would be the cranium, that's your skull. Then we have the sternum and the ribs. The vertebrae I don't have highlighted there, and the sacrum, that's the kind of like that arrowhead shaped bone at the end of the vertebral column. So those make up your axial skeleton. The others that I did not mention make up your appendicular skeleton, and that's your appendages and the bones that they are attached to. Your collarbone is called your clavicle. Your shoulder blades are called the scapula. To your shoulder is attached the bone of your upper arm, which is called the humerus. And then the humerus has two bones that go down toward your hand. And the reason for two bones, it allows your lower arm to rotate. And the bone that is attached to your thumb is the radius. It's the one that goes around the other one. When you twist your arm, that's the bone that actually goes around. So you can see it's why it's called radius. And then the one on the bottom side of your that makes up the elbow is called the ulna. And then in the hands, we have the bones that make up the hands and the wrist. The wrist bones are called the carpals. C-A-R-P-A-L-S, carpals. And both hands have these sets of bones. The bones that make up the that you would find, like for instance, making up the palm of your hand, those are called the metacarpals. Metacarpals. And then the fingers, the bones that make up the fingers, are your phalanges. Okay, now it's going down to the hip. The bones that make up the hip are called the pelvic girdle. Pelvic girdle. And attached to the pelvic girdle is the upper leg bone, which is called the femur. It's the very strong bone in your body, probably the strongest bone you have in your body, other than maybe the skull. The kneecap is called the patella. The kneecap's called the patella. Your shin bone, the main bone that's between your knee and your foot, is called the tibia. Tibia. And then the bone that goes down the side of your leg and makes up the outside of your ankle, your outside part of your ankle, is called the fibula. The fibula. And then down at the foot, we have the bones that make up the ankle. In other words, they're directly attached to the tibia and the fibula, are called the tarsals. The tarsals. The bones that make up the front part of your arch of your foot are called the metatarsals. And then your toes, all 5 of your toes that stick out the front of your foot, are called the phalanges. So I would like you to learn the names of these. These are probably the most common names that you're going to hear regularly as an adult when people talk about different parts of their body. And that will bring us to the end of this section.